Hey friends, I'm going to assume that this started right when it said that it went live and that there's probably going to be like a few, maybe 30-second delay in the video from when I actually start to be visible and audible. And I hope that you guys are having an absolutely wonderful day today. I'm going to start off today by issuing a correction. It's a needed correction. It's an important correction. I unfortunately, in my last stream, spoke about something that's pretty serious in a way that could be misunderstood. And I wanted to take some time to respond to a comment left by Love the Heaven 5 on my last stream. And specifically, what I would like to say is that I misspoke, and I'm going to take full responsibility for that. I want to issue clarification. So I spoke about the ace community, and I spoke about some of the frustrations that I have being an ace person who has sex and who has experienced sexual attraction in the past, because in my experience, from time to time, and this is incredibly rare, some of us who are like that can be gate kept, and we can be people who are treated differently. And that's a thing that we should be talking about, but the way that I worded it was overly frustrated. And it's important to note that there are other ace folks who feel this way. There are a handful of people, especially those of us who have worked in a couple of fields that some people have decided shouldn't be legal and thus aren't legal. Fields like sex work. I have friends who are sex workers who are ace, both sex workers as in the new definition of sex work and also adult entertainers who do a lot of the same things as some other kinds of sex workers. And I'm not going to be painting overly broad a brush here, but these are things that people should be talking about. These are things that people should feel comfortable talking about. And it's worth noting that if you are an ace person who has sex for whatever reason, if you're an ace person who is not quite the capital A asexual, but you are someone who experiences very little sexual attraction, but still does experience sexual attraction, your asexuality is valid. And that was the real sort of message I wanted to get across when I was talking about that. Unfortunately, being the sometimes unclear communicator that I can be, I was making mistakes in my wording. That is my bad, and I appreciate that Love the Heaven 5 made their comment, let me know what they thought, and encouraged me to issue a correction. And I really am glad that I had the ability to do that. Another thing that is worth noting that Love the Heaven 5 said in their last comment, and I hope that they either join us today or they leave a comment on this video so that way I can learn from them, because their insight's really valuable. They're very intelligent. They've clearly thought a lot and done a lot of research into this, research that I haven't done because I wasn't familiar with the term archflux. Can't pronounce that word correctly. I wasn't familiar with that word, so I really appreciated they came in and left a comment they left. But when I experience sexual aversion or sexual repulsion, it is in a temporary way. It comes and goes. And that is not the way that all other aces experience it. There are numerous aces that I know, whether I have met them face to face or whether they're just online pals, who experience it like I do, but there are also people for whom it is a single permanent state of being. And I did not want to imply that I am the best way to experience it or that I am, I guess, the most common. That was not something that I was trying to do. And it's worth noting that a lot of people in our community who do experience it, and a lot of allos who experience it as well, experience it in a single permanent state wherein they are constantly sex repulsed. And those people are equally valid. I feel as though the thing that I said about polyamory could be better for those sorts of people, but I'm also not going to imply that polyamory is easy. I don't want to do that either, because it's not. It is a challenging thing, and not everyone can be or should be polyamorous. If you are open to it, I hope that you experience it. I hope that you try it out. I hope that it works well for you. I know that I am probably polyamorous. I know that I definitely lean towards polyamory. If the question is, are you monogamous or polyamorous, I'm more inclined to say that I'm poly myself. I know other aces who are like that. I know other aces who aren't. It's one of those things where it's your mileage may vary, which is an acronym I was not familiar with before I saw that comment. And now that I've said that, now that I have spoken about that, because it's something that's absolutely worth talking about, I wanted to get into the actual main part of the video. The main part of the video that we're going to be talking about today, and for that I am going to be bringing out the whiteboard So it's still weird to me that y'all can apparently see it correctly, because I know that I can't. But I mostly kept it the same. I kept the big sections the same. I wanted to spend some time today talking about stuff like communication. This is a Asexuality O'Clock live stream that's definitely geared towards allos, or towards people who aren't capital A ace dating people who are capital A ace. And I know that's probably not the best way to explain that sort of difference, but I know a couple of other folks who have used it that same way. It's more of a personal taste sort of thing. But basically, the difference, in case you're just driving, because my tweets that we're talking about this video went out probably just a couple of seconds ago. TweetDeck is a fancy, fun tool, but it's also not that great when it comes to doing scheduled tweets. For if you are new and you don't know what that term means, what that difference is, I am someone who's a lowercase a asexual, so I'm capable of experiencing sexual attraction. I know a lot of folks who are capital A. I hope I said that I'm lowercase, because if not, then that sounds like I'm just explaining the same term two different ways. But people who are capital A ace are people who are incapable of experiencing sexual attraction. And those people are valid. Those people are, in fact, the main people for whom, as far as I know, the term asexual exists for. It's just that there are differences. And it's also worth noting that when I talk about being asexual, especially when I talk about being lowercase a asexual, I'm using a sort of relative definition, because I'm talking about from a Hispanic culture. Hispanic cultures and non-Hispanic cultures talk about sex and sexuality differently. So for me, when I talk about this, I'm talking about it relative to my experiences as a Latino man. And that's not going to be everyone else's experience, but I feel like a lot of people, when they talk about things like asexuality, they do mean it from a culturally contextual point of view, which means that they experience and talk about sex and sexuality in ways that are unique to their own cultures. And it's true that a lot of us have broader audiences than our own cultures, so I do want to talk a little bit about this. That's not the main thing I'm going to be talking about in this particular video. I'm going to be talking about communication and stuff, but it's something worth considering moving forward. So now I'm going to bring back this. I'm going to have it in front of my face, and I am going to see what's on it. I made it only a few minutes ago, but I wanted to see if I could talk about these things in order. So communication, boundaries, and more. So these little things right here, I would try to make that into a word. If I ordered it properly, it's entirely possible that I could try to turn it into a word, so it could be one of those things where it's like each letter is a word and then it goes down. I don't know what they're called. It's like a literary thing. Not a literary thing. That's a dumb thing to say. But the first thing on here is communication. So communication with your partners. And I feel like this is often something that, in my experience, some ace couples don't do, or some couples who are members of GAAD, which is Grays, Aros, Aromantics, Grays, Aros, Aces, and Demis. I'm going to use that term a lot. It's a really fantastic term. I hope that more people will start to use it. It's my favorite acronym. Yeah, Carabble. I really appreciate Jenna chiming in. That's a really great comment. But communication is something that's important for all relationships and all sorts of couples, but it's especially important for people who are dating aces and for people who are dating members of the GAAD community. And even if you are someone who is also a member of the GAAD community and your partner is a member of the GAAD community as well, I feel like it's really important that you constantly be communicating, especially because for those of you who know, the ace spectrum is a spectrum and people can move along it at different points in their lives. Something that I've thought about is making a video wherein I talk about the concept of a sexuality spectrum and people being able to move along it throughout their lives. So that's something that I probably will do in the future when I can think about it and articulate it more intelligently. But one of the reasons why it's so important that we constantly be communicating with our partners isn't just that some of us are demi and some of us aren't, because as a demi person, I am capable of experiencing sexual attraction. And my sexual attraction to someone could grow depending on how my bond with that person grows. And there are people that know this, I'm pretty open about being demi. I've only experienced sexual attraction to one person in my entire life, but as a demisexual person, it's entirely possible that in the future I could meet more people to whom I experience sexual attraction. And as a demisexual person, I understand the importance of being open and communicating about these sorts of things, because I want to be open and honest with whoever it is that I'm in a relationship with at the time. And as a demisexual person in demisexual spaces, a lot of us talk a lot more consistently and a lot more aggressively about communication. And by aggressively, I don't mean that we communicate like really, really aggressively at each other. I mean that demisexual spaces tend to be proponents of things like constant communication. And constant communication doesn't have to mean like a text message every hour or whatever. It can literally mean like just chatting with someone and constantly checking in and all that sort of stuff. And that's a really important thing if you're dating someone who's on the GAAD spectrum or in a GAAD community of any sorts, someone whose orientation is a GAAD orientation. Because without that, it's going to be really difficult for y'all to be honest and open. It's going to be really difficult for people to have sometimes uncomfortable conversations about a wide range of different things. I know a lot of people find talking about sexuality to be a little bit uncomfortable. And that's something that's really weird to me, because I absolutely love talking about sex and sexuality. Sex and sexuality are some of my favorite things to talk about. It's part of the reason why I make this sort of content, because this gives me an avenue through which I can talk about this openly and I can engage in intelligent, thoughtful conversations with y'all, my audience. I'm grateful that y'all are here. I'm grateful that we are learning from each other and that we're listening to each other. And honestly, I'm just happy to have this avenue through which I can have these sorts of conversations. I know a couple of other people on the GAAD spectrum or in the GAAD space that are also very fascinated and very much enjoy having conversations about sex and sexuality. And that's something that is pretty useful for me. That's something that's really fun. It's something that I really like doing. And I know that I'm far from alone in that. So communication is just really cool. But another thing that I wanted to talk about, the next thing in this lovely little whiteboard is, and I'm going to take a second to look at it because I see it backwards, which is part of the reason I was confused the first time I showed it to y'all. But the next thing over here is boundaries. Boundaries is a really fun one. Boundaries is something that's really important for people to talk about. And having conversations about setting boundaries can be a little bit uncomfortable. And it can also be tough, because usually the way that we've been socialized to think about having conversations about boundaries is that oftentimes we only see people having conversations about boundaries when a boundary has been broken. And that's something that's quite unfortunate. It's something that I've noticed a lot when I consume media or when I read books that talks about these sorts of things. It's important that we establish and that we make it clear that having conversations about boundaries is a positive, fun, and worthwhile thing to do. It's really important that we actually sit down and that we be open and be like, hey, I don't know what the boundaries are. I don't know what people's limits are. And I think that it's quite interesting to me that some of the best places to have those sorts of conversations and some of the groups of people who've had these sorts of conversations the best ways are actually people who are often involved in BDSM stuff. I'll be honest, I'm involved in those sorts of spaces. I'll be real transparent with y'all because I know that y'all are my audience, y'all are understanding, y'all are cool. I also know that as my audience grows, people in my audience are going to be interested in learning more about this. I'm perfectly cool having those sorts of conversations. If people want to message me, I can share my insights, I can share my thoughts, and I can share what sort of person in those spaces I am. It's actually a really neat conversation. At some point, I might actually have a longer video, not a longer video, but like a regular video where I talk about that, because there are some aces, I'm not going to say a whole lot, but there's some aces and there's some members of GAAD spaces who are really into things like BDSM. And it's often a quirky thing for the allos to think about when they think about like what asexuality is and what an asexual person looks and acts like, because they don't really think that like we would be in those sorts of spaces. But I think it's because for those of us who enjoy sex and sexuality, those sorts of spaces can be really fun. They can be really open. They can be really understanding. And because of that, there are some of us who are more comfortable talking about setting boundaries and all that stuff. And that's something that I've learned from being involved in kink spaces. And that's just me. I'm just sharing my insights. I'm not trying to speak for anyone. I'm not trying to make overgeneralizations. Y'all know that sometimes I have sloppy language. So I hope you'll be understanding, but I also hope that if you think that I'm overstating something or whatever, you will let me know so that way I can issue clarification and a comment. Like, I have a feeling that for those of us who are in GAAD spaces already, we aren't surprised by this. I think it's more like allos spaces that are surprised when they find GAAD folks who are involved in some sort of adult entertainment, some sort of kink movement, anything that involves some level of sexual liberation. And one example of this is that I can think of is when Dear Mr. Atheist had on an asexual adult entertainer. I think that was a really cool conversation. It happened a while back. You'd have to go pretty far back into Mr. Atheist videos to find it, but I do recommend that folks check it out. I think it was a cool conversation. I think that a lot of people learned. I really appreciated Mr. Atheist doing that because I think that that opened up a lot of conversations and started a lot of conversations in people's private lives about what it seemed like. I'm sorry for stopping mid-sentence. I saw some comments that I wanted to look at and I wanted to address. So I'm just, I'm gonna take a second to set up my iPad in a more prominent space. This is also one of the fun parts about live streams, especially when you do it the way that I do it, which is probably a messier way to do it. I'm sure some folks do it a little bit better than I do. But yeah, I think that that was an important conversation that for a whole bunch of people probably made some really important conversations happen, especially for people who are members of the GAAD spaces who enjoy sex, maybe not in a sexual way, but just find sex to be something that's pleasing to look at, which is not everyone. I know a lot of aces who aren't like that, even ones who aren't who don't feel any particular way about sex or sexuality. But that's the way it is for some people. I personally like the sight of sex. That's me. I'm what's called a voyeur. And if you are curious about that and you are someone who likes learning about that sort of thing, you can Google it. But basically, that's someone who likes to watch people. So let's see. I'm going to respond to a comment by my first channel. How would you even know what your boundaries are if you've never had sex or ever been in a relationship? I think it's worth pointing out, as Chenna said, that you can find out without having sex. You can find out without having a relationship. Boundaries in this context aren't just sexual boundaries. They definitely can be. I feel like a lot of people think of boundaries in relationships as being sexual boundaries, but that's not always the case. And it's worth noting that there are definitely different kinds of boundaries. I'm hoping that when people have conversations about boundaries, they have conversations about like a wider range of boundaries than just sexual boundaries. But it's really important to say, if you are someone who's never been in a relationship, I would hope that if you are about to enter into a relationship for the first time, I would hope that you feel comfortable having that conversation with your partner, with the person you're considering entering into a relationship with. And I would hope that that person would make you feel comfortable creating that sort of conversation, creating the space for people to listen and for your partner to learn. If not, that is, I'm not going to say a red flag because I can understand that being uncomfortable on both sides, but that is something to be thinking about moving forward in that relationship. It's really important that your partner be able to have those conversations. And it's okay for those conversations to be uncomfortable. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't happen. That shouldn't be a deterrent to actually having those conversations. I would hope that especially if you are about to enter into a relationship for the very first time, your partner would know and would be supportive of you and would be supportive of you exploring and setting up boundaries that you feel comfortable with. It's really important that we do have these sorts of conversations. I think that boundary setting is one of the most important things that people can talk about and that people can engage with and that people can do, especially if you are in a long distance relationship or if you or your partner have a history of engaging in a behavior that you are not super familiar with, you aren't super comfortable with. Say you are a monogamous person who is entering into a relationship with someone who is polyamorous. I almost forgot the word there, which is the reason why I hesitated. I think it's important that y'all have those sorts of conversations. Y'all make sure that y'all feel comfortable and that y'all make sure that you know how each other's feeling, especially in the beginning. It's also really important that people not just have conversations about boundaries at the beginning of their relationships. These need to be actual conversations. And an actual conversation is something, or at the very least, a good conversation, is something that you can stop having and then revisit at another point in time. Say you guys are having a conversation about boundaries and you like to have those sorts of conversations in a private space when you guys are just chilling, but you and your partner are about to go out to eat dinner. If you guys don't want to have that sort of conversation in public, that's completely understandable. That's perfectly fair. That's a matter of personal preference. And I would hope that you guys are having the sort of conversation that you can be like, all right, let's go get some dinner. And then when we come back, we can revisit this. But also the sort of conversation that both you and your partner would ideally feel comfortable revisiting. And that is, it's not always the easiest thing to do, guys. And it's okay that this is kind of tough, but it's still an important thing worth doing. I'm a peace and conflict studies person. It's literally what I'm studying. And a lot of conflicts come from people not communicating, especially non-violent conflicts, especially like local level conflicts. These often start with a break in communication. And even if they didn't start with a break in communication, they often get a lot worse when the conversations stop happening. When communication is disrupted in some way, that definitely exacerbates conflicts. And that's true at a macro level as well as at a micro level. And that's something that people need to be aware of and need to be considerate of. Also, that's a very big body language. So the next topic on this, also, please continue asking questions if you guys have questions. I really do hope that my first channel feels the advice that we're coming from. If any of us could issue a clarification, or if MFC wants any of us to issue a clarification, please ask. Also, if you aren't that person and you have questions, this is an open space. This is hopefully an important space that's starting necessary conversations and helping people figure lots of difficult stuff out. But now for the next topic on this, let's see. Next topic on this is, we're going to start to get over to the little letters. So this is the advice that is probably more useful for allos or for people who aren't super familiar with things like ace or GAAD labels, but it's important for every single person. And frankly, it's important for every single relationship. A lot of advice that we apply in this conversation specifically to GAAD folks and to their allo partners is stuff that's just useful for everyone. So the first thing on this list is rid yourself of assumptions. And yeah, we're getting out of the C and into the R of our Caravel. So the first one on this list is rid yourself of assumptions. That's an important advice for anything, any sort of relationship. Frankly, even in relationships that aren't romantic or sexual in nature, just friendships. If you want to rid yourself of assumptions, that's always a good start. Ridding yourself of assumptions enables you to learn more easily. It enables you to sort of forget about the labels that people use and focus on the individuals. And I'm someone who does talk about the importance of labels. I find labels to be really useful and to be really important. But it's also important to note that these are things that are experienced in such individual ways that it is, let's see. Oh, goodness. That was in response to the comment by Mark Caesar. That's the reason I started chuckling. But the whole thing about ridding yourself of assumptions is enabling you to learn about your romantic or sexual partner in a way that is open, honest, and also just there for the other person. This is good advice for everyone, but it's advice that is especially useful for allo people, because terms like asexuality and terms like demisexual and demisexuality and other labels that belong in GAAD spaces and to members of GAAD communities are labels that only recently started to become popular and even a little bit accepted. And I'm using the word accepted here very loosely. So it's really important to note that we're all going to experience this very differently. We're all going to have our individual takeaways. We're all going to relate to asexuality and asexuals in different ways. And same with gray sexuals, same with aromantics, demiromantics, demisexuals, and all the other beautiful parts of the GAAD community. So it's really important that we need to rid ourselves of these assumptions, even when we're communicating with other people who have the same sorts of labels as us. Because demisexuality for me requires me having a very intense emotional relationship with someone. But for other demisexuals, it can be a little bit easier. I'm not going to say that my way is the best way or is the only way, because it's really not. I am someone who I can wait for, like, it can take me years to develop a sexual attraction to someone. And that includes people that I'm in a relationship with. And that's something that can be frustrating to a lot of people, which is fair. I understand it, but it's not the way that I want things to be. It's just the way that I am. So ridding yourselves of assumptions enables you to learn about the minor differences between people who have the same labels. And it also enables you to look past the labels and start to see the person. That's a really important thing that people should be aware of. It's something that should fuel people who are dating members of GAAD spaces, even when the people who are dating members of GAAD spaces are other GAADs themselves. I'm gonna make GAAD happen, y'all. It's not gonna be like fetch. It is gonna be a popular term, and one day I'm gonna write an article that gives credit to it where credit's due, and yeah. So the next term is ask questions. This relates directly to getting rid of assumptions, but asking questions is also a fairly important thing that enables you to learn more directly. It's also worth noting that one of the first questions you should be asking your partner is, are you comfortable with me asking questions? Because not everyone is super comfortable with like playing 20 questions or like a Q&A session. And that's perfectly fair. I personally don't mind like a Q&A session or playing 20 questions. So I actually really like things like asking questions. So if people ever want to ask me questions about my stuff, I'm always very honest. Like y'all have seen me both in these chats and in other chats. I'm very direct and dynamic. I don't mince words, even if I misspeak or even if I use sloppy language. People know that I am very like open about the sorts of things that I say. I'm very open about who I am and about what I am. So asking questions is very useful for me, and it's also very useful for anyone who happens to be a partner of mine. Asking questions is also just a fun way for people who have a similar sort of personality to me to spend time, because I really like answering questions. I also really like asking questions, and I appreciate folks who are comfortable with both, because one of my favorite things to do when I have conversations about sex and sexuality with like specific individuals is to play things like 20 questions, wherein I ask a question, they ask a question, and we just sort of take turns. That's a fun thing for me. I'm very odd. So another thing is be honest. That one I could sort of understand, but my B does not look like a B. Like, goodness, my handwriting's bad, y'all. And like I have an even harder time using markers. So that one is my B. I'm also going to start to raise this a little bit more. I don't know if y'all got to see the A space at the bottom, but hey, it's an A space. So with being honest, I'm very candid. I think I'm using that word correctly. I'm very open. So if people ask me questions about like me and about like my personal tastes, I will be direct. A really funny story. The other day, I talked about aesthetic attraction, and I mentioned that like I'm extremely aesthetically attracted to red hair. And Mrs. Snarky was in the chat, and Mrs. Snarky started joking about that. And like it's true. I'll be very open and direct with these sorts of things. So people know that I'm pretty much the GAAD equivalent of an open book. And it's partially because like so much of my content, even before this, but especially recently, has talked about these sorts of things. People get to know a whole lot about me. I think that's fun. I'm actually a big fan of that because I like being open, and I like people knowing that like if they have questions, I've got answers. I can at the very least speak about my experiences. So my personal tastes, my first channel, are just people with red hair. That's an aesthetic attraction that I'm just like, wow, red hair, that is. And I've always been like that. Like I've been like that since before I started dating. So this is not a thing that I developed. So let's see. Mark Caesar brought up a very fair question. I'm perfectly fine with that. I am perfectly fine with my videos resurfacing. People are already going to attack me for being an atheist. People are going to attack me for being Latino. People are going to attack me for being queer. And if people are going to attack me, frankly, I want them to attack me accurately. I don't want them to make up like some wild nonsense. I have no problem with my personal life. Like, I'm going to respond harshly if people drag up my partners or if people try to use those against me. But if people want to like attack me personally, I have no problem with that. When I run a campaign, I'm going to do my best to not actually attack other people. I'm going to be like, hey, here are my policies. Here's why I think that my policies are best. But I'm also going to be honest with people. I know that people are going to use a lot of my past against me. I know that. That's fine. Lots of hyper-progressives would use the fact that my family is military against me. Lots of conservatives would use the fact that I'm a queer Latino against me. There are so many people who would use the fact that I'm an atheist against me. It's cool. That's fine. If people want to use these videos against me, they have my permission. I'm not going to be surprised when these videos do resurface. But frankly, these important conversations need to happen. And I don't often see people having these conversations. So even if I'm having them in a really rough way, I really would hope that me having them is worth it to the people who are in them and worth them to people who are watching them in the future. That's the thing that I really hope matters and comes from this. So yeah. And let's see. But yeah, I'm reading comments. Oh yeah. Sometimes I have to take a second to read the comments. But the whole thing about being honest, I'm going to be honest with y'all. I'm a kind of extreme example of this because I'm so open and I'm so honest. Most people aren't like me, and that's perfectly fair because like a lot of people don't sign up for having their personal life put on blast. And as a politician, I recognize, or not as a politician, but as someone who wants to be a politician, I recognize this sort of stuff is going to come up, and that's cool. So I just wanted people to have an accurate idea of who I am and what I am. And honestly, none of the stuff that I've done goes against my personal views as a humanist. None of the stuff I've done would make me look like a bad person. I'm not going to lie to y'all and say that like all of my past relationships have been perfect or whatever. I'm not going to pretend that all of my exes are my friends, but that's part of what it's like being a human being who dates and who is a person who grows up and matures in the age of the internet. So it'd be like that sometimes. So let's see. Oh yeah, there are absolutely LGBTQ folks, and I'm using the Q in that, in government offices around the US already, but there aren't asexual folks who are elected, at least not that I'm aware. I checked, and there have been asexual folks who ran for office, but there have never been any who won as far as I'm aware. This is, I'm saying that with like a big question mark at the end because it's entirely possible that I could be wrong. But I know for a fact that at least one asexual person ran in the past. And unfortunately, I checked that person did not win. It's really sad. But another thing with being honest is just be honest with your partners. And that goes directly to setting boundaries. It's okay. And in fact, I would actually recommend to set up boundaries about what can and can't be asked. I think that that's a really important part of setting boundaries. And that's, look at me tying these things together. Oh, I'm proud of me. But that is a really important part of setting up boundaries. And it's also an important part of being in a relationship. It's not the most important thing about being in a relationship, and lots of relationships don't involve like endless Q&A sessions, but especially among people who are I'm trying to think of the right word, people who are dating people outside of their sexualities. And I don't mean like people who are dating people who don't experience sexual attraction to them, although that can be part of it. I'm talking more about like people who are bisexual dating people who are straight or people who are gay. There are important questions that people need to ask about boundaries, about things like that. And those are all fair, but it's also important that people who are setting up boundaries be honest and open about the sorts of boundaries that they're going to set up. And one, that in some cases, some boundaries can move as a relationship can progress, and other boundaries are hard boundaries. And both of those boundaries are equally important, because I know that for a lot of people, if my current partner and I were ever to break up and I started dating someone else, I would not start dating them sexually attracted to them. But that doesn't mean that that would be the way it always is. that would change over time. And that's an important example of a sort of boundary that can be moved. And not every boundary is like that. Personally, I feel like the most important boundaries that matter in someone's day-to-day life are probably going to be the hard boundaries. But I do hope that the things I'm talking about make sense. I feel like if you just hopped into the chat, like, hey, bub, it might not make sense without the full context of what we're talking about, but it'd be like that when you're doing live streams. So another one is listen first. I also have other ideas that I have other ideas that I'm going to talk about because we haven't quite, I didn't fill up this board as fully as I could have, but listening first is a really important thing. There are lots of questions that people are going to have answered if they listen first. And if they listen first, then there are lots of questions that can be avoided. And those questions that can be avoided, avoiding questions isn't always the best thing, but I know some people don't like repeating themselves. And I think it's perfectly fair to not like repeating yourself, especially if you are in a relationship with someone or you're considering being in a relationship with someone. I think it's perfectly fair to have, at the very least, a minor expectation that the person you're with remembers, at the very least, important stuff. I would hope that people wouldn't push that super far and like decontextualize my statement and make it seem like I'm expecting every single person's partner to remember every single minor detail about their life. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying that it's important to listen first and to have questions if you need to ask them, but hold them back until you, one, recognize that your partner is done saying or communicating whatever it is they're saying or communicating, and then asking those questions, and also checking to make sure that the person hasn't already answered your question. And I think that that's a perfectly fair point of view, Bub. I feel like I've personally had conversations with like really good friends wherein, one, a really bad habit of mine is that when I get really sleepy, I get like extremely forgetful to the point where like if someone is having a conversation with me late at night, I will like start a sentence and then dead ass not finish it. I will honestly have like a hard stop. And it is one of the most annoying things in the world to my partner, but also it annoys a lot of people. And I think that's perfectly fair. I get it. That's part of the reason why I don't like doing phone calls late at night. I've never been in a late night phone call with anyone here except for Jamie. And I'm sure, I don't think that I was super tired, but like when I'm like trying to stay awake, I definitely will like start to forget stuff. And that's a bad thing about me. That's part of the reason why if I can avoid it, I don't have late night conversations with people. So one of the other things I wanted to say that isn't on the lovely board is talking about like doing a certain level of research. This is another one of those things that relates to ridding yourself of assumptions, but at the same time, you can do a little bit of research. Like if someone says that they are asexual and you are texting them, it's okay to be like, all right, now that this person said I'm ace, I'm going to Google that. And that is a really important piece of advice if you're dating someone on the GAAD spectrum. You shouldn't be taking what you read as gospel. You should be willing to ask questions. But I know a couple of people in GAAD spaces and also in other queer spaces who don't like having to define these terms. I think that's fair. I personally don't mind it, even for people that I'm either dating or that I'm considering dating. But I'm a little bit odd, I guess, in that sense. So if you really want to like understand your partners better and you don't want them to have to explain every single little thing to you, then you probably should be willing to do a tiny bit of research. And I'm not saying you have to get like a PhD on the subject. I'm saying that at the very least with GAAD folks, you can go visit the Avon wiki. I did have, oh man, when I had my isekai stream, I had like a list of like websites that people could visit for like light novels and stuff. I really should have done that for this, but I started preparing this whiteboard a little bit late. In a future stream, I would like to talk specifically about like great resources for people who want to learn about asexuals and about GAAD folks. Not today, though. Just know that if you are dating someone who is a member of this community, it's probably not a terrible idea to go onto the Avon wiki, and if you find any words that they have told you apply to them, give them a Google. It's also worth noting that the Avon wiki is a constantly expanding resource. It's, in my opinion, the best English language resource, which is part of the reason I brag about it. But it's an expanding resource, and there are other places that have words that might more accurately describe people. I saw a Google image that had like a list of, I think, like 6 or 7 different types of sexualities that some ace folks or some GAAD folks might be. And these were just different sorts of words that had like really handy, in some cases, very specific definitions. They were a little bit like sapiosexual and stuff, but in some cases not quite so classist, because sapiosexual is a problematic word that people, I feel like people are a little bit overexcited to call themselves sapiosexuals. And I personally feel like sapiosexual, and I'm not the only person who feels this way. I've read articles by other folks who are like, hey, I understand that word, but like maybe it's not that great of a word. And I know that just by using the word problematic, there are some folks who are gonna like roll their eyes, which is fair. But that's just the way I feel about it. Doing a little bit of research can help. There are also other places, like Chenna pointed out, like the Asexual Journal, which is a place that's constantly, the impression I've been given, I'm not going to say this is accurate, but the impression that I've been given is that they're always looking for new people. They're always looking for new writers to come in and give stuff, especially other ace folks. So sapiosexual, for those of you who don't know, refers to the idea of being either romantically or sexually attracted to someone on the basis of their intelligence. Part of the reason why I and a couple of other folks might view it as a little bit classist, and this is not always the way that it's used, is that in some cases, some people conflate sapiosexual with the idea of being attracted to people who have an education. And usually having an education is synonymous with having an advanced degree. So a degree from a 4-year university. And I'm sure some people can kind of understand why that's a little bit classist. It's okay. If you are someone who uses it like Smitty, who says it's someone who's smart regardless of the level of education they've received, that's a lot more understandable. What I'm talking about is how some specific folks use it. This is one of those times I use language that it's one of those times that I use language that might be a little bit sloppy. But hopefully now some people understand a little bit better where I'm coming from. And I'm not saying that, like, I hope I didn't say that it was like always classist. I'm pretty sure I didn't, but if I did, my bad, not what I meant. There are other words like that, and it's true that there, Jamie is right. At some point, I might have a greater conversation about why some folks might find that word to be a little bit uncomfortable. I hope that people can understand why it is that some people might find it a little bit uncomfortable. I hope at the very least that makes a little bit of sense. My language is sometimes rough, and I hope that people will give me time. I hope that people will alert me to when my language is being a little bit rough or when a clarification is necessary, because I understand that. I think it's perfectly fair for someone to hear a video of mine and be like, your language was a little bit sloppy, even if the point you were saying makes sense. But yeah, and Jamie is right. One of the really big issues I have with sapiosexual is that usually in the context I've heard it in, once again, not saying always, but usually in the context that I've heard it in, it's from people who say things like, oh, you talk so well for a person from this race or this class. And that is a, yikes, that's a not great way to communicate. So Smitty, with folks, there are some people, not necessarily people of any specific gender or sexual orientation, but in some cases, there are people who don't like the word folks as it's traditionally spelled because it's not particularly inclusive. And folks is more inclusive. I am familiar with it from being in social justice spaces with Latinx folks, because Latino and Latina are gendered words, and Latinx, which is a popular alternative, not the most popular alternative, but a popular alternative to Latino, Latina, or in some cases Latin or Latin with the at symbol at the end, which is in that, which are two other popular variations, are like, oh yeah, cool. People are talking about this in the comments section. If anyone watches this video later, this is a good place for y'all to have the live chat replay on, because the comment section, tight. I'm pretty sure I just said, yeah, those were stuff that I do talk about, Latin and Latin with the at symbol. For several years, I used Latin with the at symbol. I had an old Tumblr blog that had a couple hundred followers that was, I guess, for like Tumblr at the time, that was somewhat popular, where I talked about the different forms of Latino and Latina, and I included Latinx, Latin with the at symbol at the end. I don't know how to pronounce that one, or Latin. I typically use Latin with the at symbol up until fairly recently. Now I'm a member of an organization called the Latinx Humanist Alliance, and that is a social justice arm of the American Humanist Association. We use the Latinx, but someone left a comment. I can't remember if it was a comment in the live chat or if it was a comment in like the actual like video, where they talked about how some search engine softwares have a hard time catching the X. So some people like to use the E at the end, Latin. I don't know how to say it, but that one. So that's like me not being able to say it's part of the reason I don't often use Latin with the E at the end. But I know people who do. I think that all of those are perfectly fine. I just personally use Latinx because I am someone who exists in a little bit of an academic sphere, because, you know, grad student, as fortunate and unfortunate as that is, and lots of people lots of people in spaces that I am in do like Latinx. I don't know if there's any specific reason why it is that we like Latinx. I think it's just because other academic folks have taken to using Latinx, so we've just sort of like realized that that's the one that's in mode right now, the one that's like popular. I'll probably do a video on that. I made an article a couple of years ago for Patheos that talked about why I defend Latinx and why I like it, and that was something that other people did really not like. It was annoying. There were people who decided that that was worth rebutting, and they didn't do a very good job rebutting it. So yeah. Cool. I think it's really neat that the conversation in the chat is talking about some of the stuff it's talking about right now. Part of the reason why people aren't big fans of things like sapiosexuality are stuff like that. Things like people discriminating against people who speak AAVE. I don't know if that's the right way to say that. I don't know how to pronounce it, because I have fooled people into thinking that I'm better at English than I actually am. It's a trick. It's part of the reason why sometimes my brain will stop and I'll ESL. And I'm using that in like a mocking way, which some people won't be cool with, but like I'm someone who did learn English as a second language. So I actually I feel like if anyone, it's one of those things where it's like I can say these sorts of things because I went through these experiences. I was born with constant ear infections, and as such, I had a really hard time hearing up until I was about 7. And because of that, I had to talk about I had to go to things like a speech therapist, and I had to learn English. I had to go to ESL classes. So when I talk about these things, I am talking about firsthand experiences that I had. And it's true that, but Measlebub brings up a good point. I am better at speaking English than I am at speaking Spanish, but the reality is I am a lot more fluent in Spanish than I probably let on. I have difficulty writing in Spanish, but I can speak in Spanish pretty solidly. I'll make like minor mistakes. And I'm not saying that my Spanish is perfect by any means, not saying that. It's just that like sometimes when I speak in Spanish, I'll get really nervous. So that's part of the reason I don't film as much as I would like to in Spanish. I would like to make content about asexuality and about things like the Avon Wiki in Spanish, and I have plans to do that in the future because there are plenty of asexuals who only speak Spanish. There are lots of resources that exist for Spanish-speaking asexuals that are only in Spanish. I would like to both translate those sorts of materials into English and also make more English-only materials for the GAAD community available in Spanish. And I have written in Spanish before in the past. People can find my writing if they search for it, but it is kind of hard to find because it's pretty rare. And I would like to reach like a level of true fluency in Spanish wherein I can write and I can speak perfectly. And Chenna, that's the exact like thing that I have difficulty with, both the gendering and the conjugations of some verbs. Both of those things really heck me up. And I'm going to make it a habit to start saying heck things up more often because people really seem to like it, and also because it's just fun. I think it's a really cute alternative to far more forceful language. And I like far more forceful language usually, but sometimes cute triumphs force. And this is one of those times. But it's true that like I'm afforded a certain level of power as someone who speaks two languages. I think that that's definitely true, but that doesn't mean that like I want to speak another language imperfectly. If I'm going to speak a language as often as I can and as often as I want to, because I actually prefer Spanish, y'all, I would like to speak it at the very least as well as I can speak English right now. And my English right now is imperfect, but I speak English obviously fluently. I write in English. My writing is far from perfect, but like people very clearly understand what I'm saying. And partially because of stuff like how Spanish has different word endings for like the level of respect you afford a certain person, or for the fact that you're talking to like a group of people, and English doesn't have that for the most part. And also things like gendering that exist in Spanish that don't exist in English. I feel like writing and speaking in Spanish is considerably more difficult than even native, and especially in some cases, native speakers give it credit for, because Spanish is like really hard, y'all. And it's treated really weirdly in the United States, especially in the school system, because we sort of treat Spanish as like a default thing that like all of our students should know. And it's kind of true that more people, like it's pretty true that more people should be speaking Spanish, but the way our schools teach it's really weird. It's treated as like the sort of default, and people are like, oh, I spoke Spanish when I was in high school. Spanish is hecka hard, y'all. Like Spanish is it's kind of a really difficult language to learn in much the same way as like French, because French has similar difficulties and like similar barriers that Spanish does. I speak a tiny bit of French, and the French that I speak is very little, but I can read it pretty all right. But it's just like the same difficulties that exist in Spanish exists for French, but I don't have an intuitive understanding of French like I do of Spanish. I think in both languages, wait, so let's see. I don't see, weird. Spanish is a Romance language, but English is also a Romance language, but English has like this thing that a lot of other Romance languages don't have, where there are a couple of like different, I guess, barriers that exist in other Romance languages that don't exist in English. Because like if I'm talking to a principal in English, I don't have to treat them with the same level of respect. Or if I do, I have to use different words altogether. And that's not the case with Spanish. With Spanish, how you relate to the other person, even in a one-on-one level, affects the sorts of language. Wait, it's a Germanic language? Oh, well, I did not know that. But yeah, and I think that that's one of the common factors that makes Romance languages difficult to understand in a truly fluent sense, where you can like sort of intuitively understand things, because like there are certain things that I can intuitively understand in other like Romance languages that I have a harder time with, I guess, Germanic languages. Also, Genuinely, my bad. I really appreciate that correction, Jamie. You're the best. I honestly did not know that, y'all. I guess it's because like all the stuff that I study directly relates to like Hispanic stuff, and I just sort of assume, yeah. This is the vosotros tú usted thing, my first channel. It's part of the reason why a lot of English speakers have a difficult time learning Spanish. That's not the only obstacle. The gendered languages is the other obstacle, and also the fact that it's a whole other language. Learning languages is tough, especially for adults. And also, thanks, Smitty. Appreciate you too. I genuinely did not know that, y'all. I learned something new. The vosotro and tú thing, it relates to if you are completely unfamiliar with Spanish and you're very confused as to what I'm talking about. There are different like forms of speech you have to use when you're communicating with people who are in like a higher level of like social standing than you are. And that is not as, it's the case in a different way in English and possibly some other Germanic languages. I don't know any other Germanic languages, so I can't speak to that. That's right. Bubba's right. And the way that this affects speaking in Spanish is that you have to end words differently. You don't have to use different words altogether, although you can, and that might be helpful in some cases. But you do have to end words differently. So even if you're saying the exact same sentence that you would to like your best friend who you can speak to in a more respectful way or in a less respectful way, like you two are like people of equal social standing, you two don't have to like tread on eggshells around each other. In Spanish, you have to do something a little bit different. And that's one of the reasons why it is that learning these sorts of languages can be difficult. And I feel like when I was learning the two different languages in school, I never really understood that growing up. And I feel like if I understood that difference, if people made that sort of quiet understanding a little bit louder, then maybe that would help explain why it is that some people who learn Spanish in school forget it when they get older or have difficulties with it. And I think it's perfectly okay to have those sorts of conversations. At some point, it probably would be cool if we just had a sort of language stream, because languages, learning languages is really neat. Learning languages is actually one of my favorite things. And yeah, if you guys want to support me on Patreon, that'd be really helpful. Thanks. We got really derailed in this conversation, but I guess I can talk a little bit more about like the whole researching thing. The whole researching thing is really helpful if you actually want to learn about these sorts of topics in a sort of independent way, independently of you dating someone who's a member of this community or you having friends and family who are members of these communities. I think it's really important. How close is Portuguese to Spanish? I'm gonna respond to this. Spanish and Portuguese are fairly close, but I feel like people overstate how close they are. They're definitely similar languages, and if you understand Spanish, you can piece together what people are saying in Portuguese, but I don't think that this idea that like if you speak one, you can speak the other is particularly like accurate, because I can piece together what people are saying, but I can also piece together what people are saying in Italian, and I absolutely cannot speak Italian. Let me tell you, I tried that. It did not go well. So learn, like, instead of making your own mistakes, learn from Luciano's. Don't repeat the sorts of hiccups that I've made. And yeah, so this whole thing about researching is really important. It's really important because it helps us, one, it helps us connect with people who are in these communities, because I know in the future, if people start researching asexuality online, if people start researching asexuality on YouTube, in some cases, they're going to find my videos. And that's really neat. That's part of the reason why I want to create a lot of different asexuality content. I think that that's like really important stuff. And I think it's also really helpful. I'm like reading the comments and I'm getting like derailed. I'm sort of derailing myself. I honestly think that I shave when I go to school or when I go to like work, so people can tell how often I go to school or to work from like how bearded I am. So honestly, I want people to think of the doggo memes. The doggo memes are my favorite memes. I really appreciate Shibus. I'm doing my best. It's just that my best isn't very good. But this whole thing with like researching and all of this stuff is it's really important to understand the community as a whole. It's really important to connect with people who are in the community. Part of the reason why I've made so many of the friends that I've made is because I have started creating this sort of expansive content. I've started talking about this far more aggressively. I started talking about this in far more detail than I had in the past, because before this year, I had 2 videos that talked about asexuality in some way or another. I had a video that talked about asexuality and made jokes about Ratchet Deadlocked, which is one of my favorite video games. I talked about being asexual. I talked about being ace-sexual, and also ace is a snack. I don't feel bad making that joke. And then I had another video where I talked about the primary versus secondary model of sexual attraction, which is the model that most accurately reflects, I guess, the way that I experience demisexuality and asexuality. I'm not going to say it's the best model. I'm going to say that it's the best one for me. It's worth checking out if you haven't already checked it out. Those are videos from way back in the day, back when I was still living in Greensboro, and that was a long time ago. That was before I had 200 subscribers, y'all, and now I'm at 400. Ratchet Deadlocked is probably my favorite video game of all time. It's definitely my favorite violent video game. If you haven't played it, you absolutely should. But also, getting it is kind of hard unless you have a PlayStation 3, where they have like, I think they have like a bundle. And in creating those videos, I had lots of my favorite conversations with people. People were really engaged. People were really into that content. And I wanted to make more of it, but then I moved away and I didn't have the time. I also didn't have like the energy to be creating that sort of content, because creating that sort of content, creating that sort of content is kind of emotionally draining, because one of the things that comes with any sort of advocacy, but especially advocacy that talks about like being a member of the GRSM or the LGBTQ community, LGBTQIA+, whichever one you want to use, that's up to you. But if you create that sort of content, you're putting yourself out there. And yes, this video is going a little bit longer than I wanted it to. Gonna make a couple more points, then we're gonna get going. But this one is longer, y'all. I wasn't expecting it to be, but now I'm in the space, I'm having fun, and I'm talking about all this important stuff. I just want to keep it going. Also, apparently I'm really fond of doing this. Creating this sort of content is really important, because in creating this sort of content, I've been able to connect with a whole bunch of new people. I've been able to make new friends. I've been able to join new communities, and also I've been able to help other people. And that's really important. I've made friends from people who had questions about asexuality that they didn't know who they could ask, because in some cases they had just discovered what asexuality was, or in other cases they'd always kind of known that they were asexual and about asexuality, but they had greater questions and they didn't feel as though just going to a definition could help them relate to or could help them find the sorts of answers they needed. So they needed other people to chat with. And that's part of the reason why, and this is the first time I'm mentioning this on video, I am in fact creating a advice column for members of the GAAD community. Once again, GAAD is gray Aces, Aros, and Demis. Gonna keep using it. It's gonna be popular, y'all. I'm gonna make it happen. I am, in fact, creating that advice column. I think it's going to be really useful. Some people who I deeply admire, who I wouldn't have met if I hadn't been open about me being a resource that people could approach, are the people who inspired me to do that. And that is one of the reasons why I want to do it. It's one of the reasons why I want to continue to be an advocate. I want to continue to be a resource. And I think it's really important. I think it has the potential to help a lot of people. And I'm hoping that it becomes like a real thing. I'm probably going to be collaborating with some people to make it happen. I want to have someone who is on the aromantic spectrum with me. I have an idea of who it is that I'm going to ask, but I haven't asked that person yet. That person is, that person's here. So that person probably knows exactly who they are. But I'm hoping that if that person says no, then I can probably ask other folks, but I don't want to answer questions that I can't relate to. And I can relate to questions about being demi, I can relate to questions about being ace, but I can't relate to questions about being gray or about being aromantic. And I am not going to try to do that. I want this column to be something that's helpful for people. I want it to be able to inspire people. So I'm going to bring on other folks, and we're going to work together, and we're going to make something that's awesome. And that's part of talking about communication. It's part of being open. It's part of answering and asking questions. And all that stuff is, yeah, it's right here, guys. All that stuff except for boundaries, but boundaries are going to be there too, because I know that some of us are going to have questions that we don't feel comfortable answering. I already have a boundary in that context, in the sense that I can't and I won't answer questions about being aromantic, because that's not an experience that I've lived. And I don't want to take up space and answer questions that I can't honestly answer, that I can't answer in my own lived experiences, because this is something that we need more than just dictionary definitions for. We need to ask questions. We need to be ready to have conversations. We need to be in communication with people. We need to do this stuff right here. And yeah, we also need to make ace spaces. That said, I think that's enough. I think that's enough like super serious stuff. If you're new here, hi. If you're new here and you see this in the future, just know that I like you a whole lot. I hope you stick around. Hope we can have some awesome conversations together. And so I'm going to say that gray is a kind of middle ground, that some people conceptualize demisexual as a sort of gray ground, or as a sort of like middle ground between asexuality and allosexuality. It's not really true. Gray is better, I guess, kind of middle ground, but that also implies that it's a transitionary step. It's not. It's a fully accurate, it's a fully valid position for some people to have, that some people just are, but it is gray adjacent. So it's a difficult thing to describe, and I'm not going to try to describe it any more than that. I have friends who are gray who could answer that a lot more accurately than I could. I would encourage you to I would encourage folks to research this sort of stuff themselves. There are members of the secular community, which a lot of y'all are, but not everyone here is. There are members of the secular community who are gray, who talk and write about gray stuff. But yeah, watch my other stuff. I'm out here creating content. I'm out here living the life. I'm out here doing my best to be an advocate, y'all. And now I'm going to let you go. But I had a lot of fun with this. I hope that y'all had fun with this. And honestly, there are 2 other live streams. There is 1 interview that I have done, and then there are, I think, a total of 4 asexuality o'clocks, because I'm one of those people that I start a series off with number 0 as opposed to number 1. So yeah, there are a couple of other folks who are out here creating content that's similar. There are other folks who are doing stuff that's based and talks about components of asexuality, like Tria, whose videos I would absolutely recommend to anyone who wants to see stuff about asexuality. I noticed that some of the stuff that Tria has created that talks about asexuality are about asexuality and social components, more than just the lived experiences of being ace. But all 3 of her videos are absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend that people check out all of them. If you're not subscribed to Tria, you absolutely should be. And yeah, I'm definitely working on more asexuality o'clocks, both the traditional videos and the live streams, as well as interviews. I'm hoping to interview more folks. And Bub is right. I had a really fun conversation with Atheistic Snail and with Bub all about asexuality and the different ways that it happened. Tria had a conversation with Objectively Subjective the other day about asexuality that I would recommend. And yeah, peace out, friends. I'm going to talk to y'all later.